California, known for its sunny beaches and vibrant cities, transforms into a land of mystery and fear during Christmas. Beneath the holiday cheer lie tales of ghostly figures, cursed landmarks, and chilling encounters. Tonight, we'll explore 10 terrifying Christmas ghost stories from across the Golden State. From haunted houses in Pasadena to spectral lights in Griffith Park and mysterious sightings on the Golden Gate Bridge. So, dim the lights, settle in, and join us on a journey through California's haunted holiday history. Story number 1. The Woman on Mulholland Drive. Mulholland Drive, a winding road that snakes through the hills of Los Angeles, is infamous for its treacherous curves and panoramic views of the city. By day, it's a picturesque drive. By night, it's a labyrinth of shadows and sudden turns that have claimed countless lives. Among the locals, there's a chilling legend tied to this stretch of asphalt. Every Christmas Eve, drivers report seeing a woman in white standing in the middle of the road. Her sudden appearance has caused many accidents, her haunting figure forever etched into the memories of those who survived. For Alex Warren, the legend was nothing more than an urban myth, an amateur filmmaker with a passion for the paranormal. Alex had spent years chasing ghost stories across California. When he heard about the Mulholland woman, he knew it was the perfect subject for his next project. "You're actually going up there on Christmas Eve?" his friend Sarah asked. Incredulous, Alex shrugged, packing his camera and audio equipment. "Why not? If she's real, I'll get the footage. If not, I've got a great view of the city. Win-win." Sarah hesitated, her tone serious. "Just be careful. People say she's not just a ghost. There's something wrong about her." Alex laughed it off and set out just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm, orange glow. The road was eerily quiet as Alex navigated the sharp turns, his headlights cutting through the darkness. He parked at a small overlook near one of the more infamous curves, where the legend said she was most often seen. Setting up his tripod and camera, he aimed the lens toward the road. The first few hours were uneventful. Alex filmed the empty road, occasionally capturing the headlights of passing cars. Midnight approached, and with it, an unsettling stillness. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees, and the temperature seemed to drop. At 12:15 a.m., it happened. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, stepping into the middle of the road. She wore a flowing white dress, her hair cascading down her back. Alex's breath hitched as he zoomed in. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her bare feet silent against the asphalt. She turned toward him, and for a moment, their eyes met through the camera's lens. Her face was pale, almost translucent, but it was her eyes that froze Alex in place. They were empty, not blind, but void of anything human. She raised a hand, pointing directly at him. The sound of screeching tires shattered the silence as a car came around the curve, its driver slamming on the brakes to avoid her. The car skidded, veering off the road and crashing into the guardrail. Alex's heart pounded as he grabbed his camera and ran toward the wreck. The driver, a middle-aged man, stumbled out of the car, his face pale with shock. "Did you see her?" he gasped, clutching his chest. "She was right there." Alex nodded, helping the man to the side of the road. "Stay here," he said. "I need to check something." He turned back toward the spot where the woman had stood, but she was gone. The road was empty, save for the faint outline of her footprints in the dust. Alex followed the prints, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The footprints led him to a small overlook. There, at the edge of the cliff, he found an old photograph pinned beneath a rock. It was faded and weathered, showing a young woman in a white dress, her face radiant with joy. On the back, a name and date were scrawled in elegant handwriting. Evelyn Harper, December 24th, 1956. Alex returned to the wrecked car, but the driver was gone. Panic set in as he called out, his voice echoing through the empty night. There was no response. He searched the area, but the man had vanished, leaving behind only the damaged vehicle. Unease gnawed at Alex as he packed up his gear and drove back to his apartment. He spent the next day researching Evelyn Harper. What he found sent chills down his spine. Evelyn had been a Hollywood starlet in the 1950s, known for her beauty and charm. On Christmas Eve 1956, she had been driving along Mulholland Drive to meet her fiancé when her car lost control on the curb. She plunged off the cliff. Her body never recovered. Rumors swirled about foul play, a jealous rival, an enraged lover, but nothing was ever proven. That night, Alex reviewed his footage. The camera had captured everything: the woman's appearance, the crash, and the driver's frantic questions. But as he scrubbed through the timeline, he noticed something chilling. In the final moments before the woman disappeared, she turned toward the camera and smiled. Her lips moved, forming words that sent a shiver down his spine. "Help me." Alex tried to rationalize what he'd seen, but the image haunted him. He released the footage as part of his documentary, sparking widespread interest and reigniting the legend of the Mulholland woman. But Alex knew the truth was far more terrifying than the legend. Every Christmas Eve, he found himself drawn back to Mulholland Drive, searching for answers. And each year, as the clock struck midnight, he felt her presence, the ghostly figure in white waiting for someone to uncover the truth of her death, or to join her in the shadows of the winding road. Story number 2. The Singing Spirits of Mission San Gabriel. Mission San Gabriel, nestled in the heart of California, is a relic of the past. Its weathered adobe walls and towering bell tower tell stories of faith, resilience, and tragedy. Founded in 1771, the mission once thrived as a spiritual and cultural hub, but its history is marred by tales of disease, suffering, and loss. Among the locals, a chilling legend persists. Every Christmas Eve, the spirits of those who lived and died at the mission return, their ethereal voices blending with the pealing of the church bells in a haunting melody. Elena Reyes had always been drawn to the mission's haunting beauty. As a historian specializing in California's missions, she had spent countless hours poring over archives and walking the grounds of Mission San Gabriel. But it wasn't just history that intrigued her. Stories of ghostly singing and inexplicable phenomena had circulated for centuries, and Elena couldn't resist the opportunity to experience it for herself. On Christmas Eve, armed with her notebook, a digital recorder, and a flashlight, Elena arrived at the mission just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The church was closed to visitors, but she had secured special permission from the mission's caretaker, Father Miguel, to explore the grounds after hours. "You may hear things," Father Miguel had warned earlier that day. "But remember, the mission is a place of peace. The spirits mean no harm." Elena had nodded politely, though skepticism lingered in her mind. Ghost stories were intriguing, but she had yet to encounter anything she couldn't explain. The mission was eerily quiet as Elena walked through the courtyard. The cool December air carried the faint scent of frankincense and aged wood. Her footsteps echoed against the cobblestones as she made her way to the chapel. Inside, the pews sat in solemn rows, illuminated by the soft glow of candles left burning on the altar. Elena took a seat in the back, her recorder running. For the first hour, nothing happened. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden beams above. She jotted down notes, documenting the atmosphere and her observations. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, she heard it. The first notes were faint, almost imperceptible. A single voice, pure and sorrowful, rose from somewhere within the chapel. It was soon joined by others, a harmonious blend of men, women, and children singing in a language Elena couldn't understand. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, yet tinged with an indescribable sadness. Elena's heart raced as she scanned the chapel. It was empty, the pews untouched, yet the voices surrounded her, filling the space with an otherworldly resonance. She grabbed her flashlight and followed the sound, which seemed to lead her toward the bell tower. The singing grew louder as she ascended the narrow, spiral staircase. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of flowers, roses and lilies, wafted through the air. When she reached the top, she found the bell room empty. The massive bronze bells hung silent, their surfaces glinting faintly in the moonlight. Yet the voices continued, now mingled with the faint tolling of a bell that wasn't moving. Elena activated her recorder, capturing the spectral choir. She spoke into the device, her voice trembling. "I'm in the bell tower of Mission San Gabriel. There's no one here, but the singing it's all around me. It's beautiful and heartbreaking." Suddenly, the singing stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on her like a weight. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, her form translucent and glowing faintly. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her eyes met Elena's, and in them, Elena saw a depth of sorrow that took her breath away. The woman raised a hand and pointed toward the courtyard below. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Elena followed her gaze and saw a group of figures gathered in the courtyard. They were dressed in the clothing of the mission's early inhabitants, indigenous people and Spanish settlers. They stood in a circle, their heads bowed as if in prayer. Elena descended the tower as quickly as she could, her pulse pounding in her ears. When she reached the courtyard, the figures were gone. Only the faint scent of flowers lingered. Back in her hotel room, Elena reviewed the recording. The singing was clear, each note resonating with haunting clarity. But as she listened closely, she noticed something else. Faint whispers beneath the melody, voices speaking in a mixture of Spanish and an indigenous language she couldn't identify. She replayed the recording several times, jotting down the fragments she could make out. One phrase repeated itself over and over, "Perdonanos, forgive us." Elena spent the next day researching the mission's history, focusing on its darker chapters. She uncovered accounts of forced labor, disease, and conflict that had decimated the indigenous population. The mission's success had come at a great cost, and the weight of that history seemed to linger in the air. She returned to Father Miguel, sharing her findings and playing the recording. The priest listened in silence, his expression grave. "The spirits are seeking peace," he said finally. "They sing not to frighten, but to be heard. Perhaps your work can help them find the forgiveness they seek." Elena's article about the haunting at Mission San Gabriel sparked widespread interest. Readers were captivated by her recordings and her poignant exploration of the mission's history. Paranormal investigators flocked to the site, but none captured evidence as compelling as Elena's. Every Christmas Eve, Elena returned to the mission, standing in the courtyard as the clock struck midnight. The voices always returned, their song as beautiful and mournful as ever, and each year, she felt a deeper connection to the spirits who sang, their longing for peace echoing through the centuries. Mission San Gabriel remains a place of mystery and reverence, its bells tolling for the living and the dead. And for those who listen closely on Christmas Eve, the voices of the past still sing, a haunting reminder of the souls who once called the mission home. Story number 3. The Ghosts of the Hollywood Roosevelt. The Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel stands as a monument to old glamour. Its terracotta facade, arched windows, and lush palm-lined courtyard seem plucked from a bygone era. The hotel's halls echo with whispers of Hollywood's golden age. But not all the echoes are from the living. During the Christmas season, the Roosevelt transforms into something magical. Garlands strung across the grand lobby, a towering tree glittering with lights, and carolers filling the air with music. But beneath the holiday cheer, there's an undercurrent of something darker. Guests speak of cold drafts in the warm halls, strange figures in the mirrors, and whispers in the night. And more often than not, they mention her, Marilyn Monroe. It was December 24th, 2005, when Emma Caldwell checked into the Roosevelt, a struggling actress from Ohio. Emma had come to Los Angeles chasing stardom, but had found little more than rejection and disappointment. Her agent had stopped returning her calls, and her last audition, for a toothpaste commercial, had ended with the casting director telling her she just didn't have the look. Emma couldn't afford the Roosevelt, but she'd booked a single night anyway. If she couldn't feel like a star, at least she could pretend to be one. The hotel's history intoxicated her. Montgomery Clift, Clark Gable, and Marilyn herself had walked these halls. Maybe some of their magic would rub off on her. Her room was on the 10th floor, small but elegant, with a view of Hollywood Boulevard. She unpacked her single suitcase, hung her one decent dress in the closet, and settled onto the bed with a glass of complimentary champagne. For a moment, she let herself dream, and then the mirror moved. First, it was subtle, like a ripple across the glass. Emma thought it was a trick of the light or her imagination. She leaned closer, squinting, the mirror still. She shook her head and laughed nervously, chalking it up to exhaustion. But then it moved again. This time, the ripple coalesced into a shape, a figure standing just behind her. Emma whirled around, but the room was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. The champagne glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. She called the front desk, her voice trembling. The clerk, a bored-sounding man named Todd, tried to reassure her. "It's an old hotel, ma'am," he said. "Mirrors do weird things sometimes." Emma insisted on switching rooms. Todd reluctantly agreed, moving her to the 8th floor. Her new room was nearly identical to the first, but the air felt heavier, as if the walls were holding their breath. Emma bolted the door and double-checked the closet before crawling into bed. She left the light on. The dream started as soon as she fell asleep. She was in the lobby, dressed in a glittering gold gown she didn't own. The chandeliers sparkled above her, and the air buzzed with laughter and music. Celebrities filled the room, their faces familiar yet distant, like actors in an old movie. She turned and saw Marilyn Monroe sitting at the bar, her platinum hair glowing like a halo. Marilyn raised a glass to Emma, her red lips curling into a knowing smile. "You shouldn't have come here," Marilyn said, her voice soft and melodic. Emma tried to respond, but her voice wouldn't come. The room around her began to shift. The music slowed, distorting into a low, menacing hum. The faces of the guests melted into shadows, their eyes hollow and black. Marilyn remained, her smile widening unnaturally as she reached out a hand. Emma woke with a gasp, her heart pounding. The room was silent, but the sense of unease lingered. She checked the clock, 3:12 a.m. The mirror was rippling again. This time, Emma didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and fled, running barefoot down the carpeted hall. The elevator felt agonizingly slow, the hum of its motor echoing in the stillness. When the doors opened, she practically fell inside, jamming the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended, the lights flickered. A faint, floral scent filled the air, jasmine and rose. Emma's stomach turned as a voice whispered behind her, "Do you believe in ghosts?" She spun around, but the elevator was empty. The voice came again, this time from the speaker above. It was soft, feminine, and tinged with amusement. "We all leave something behind." The elevator shuddered to a stop. The doors slid open, revealing not the lobby but a dimly lit corridor. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with old photographs in cracked frames. Emma recognized the faces, actors, singers, and directors, all long dead. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she stepped hesitantly into the hall. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She turned, but there was no one there. The floral scent grew stronger, almost suffocating, as the whispers began again, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. Emma pressed her hands over her ears, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. "Stay with us. You belong here, just like her." Emma ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. The corridor seemed endless, twisting and turning in impossible directions. The photographs blurred together, their faces melting into grotesque shapes. She stumbled and fell, her hands scraping against the rough carpet. When she looked up, she was back in her room. The sun was rising over Hollywood Boulevard when Emma finally left the hotel. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she handed her keycard to Todd at the front desk. He barely glanced at her, his expression bored. "Rough night?" he asked. Emma didn't answer. She stepped out into the crisp morning air, the weight of the Roosevelt's walls lifting from her shoulders. She didn't look back. Later that day, a housekeeper cleaning Emma's room found a single lipstick stain on the bathroom mirror. It was shaped like a kiss, and beneath it, scrawled in red, were 3 words: "She was here." The Hollywood Roosevelt remains a hotspot for tourists and ghost hunters alike, each hoping for a brush with the supernatural. Many claim to have seen Marilyn in the mirrors or heard the faint strains of Montgomery Clift's trumpet in the halls. But those who stay during the holidays speak of something more: whispers in the night, floral scents that linger too long, and a feeling that the past is closer than it seems. Perhaps it's just the magic of Hollywood, or perhaps the Roosevelt stars never truly leave. Story number 4. The Christmas Chase in Sierra Nevada. The Sierra Nevada mountains are a place of untamed beauty, their dense forests and snow-capped peaks drawing adventurers year-round. But among the towering pines and hidden trails lies an enduring legend: Bigfoot. Stories of the creature have circulated for decades, with sightings increasing in the winter months. Locals warn campers and hikers to stay vigilant, especially during the long, dark nights when the snow muffles sound and escape becomes impossible. One tale stands out among the rest: the Christmas Eve chase of the Wallace family. For the Wallaces, the trip to Sierra Nevada was supposed to be a quiet escape. Mark and Lisa Wallace, along with their 2 children, Emma and Jake, had planned a Christmas camping trip to reconnect and unplug from their busy lives in Sacramento. They arrived at the secluded campsite in late afternoon, the ground blanketed in fresh snow. A small cabin served as their shelter, its rustic charm enhanced by the warm glow of the fireplace inside. "This is perfect," Lisa said, hanging a garland over the mantel while Jake and Emma unpacked board games. Mark smiled, stepping out onto the porch to admire the view. The forest stretched endlessly, the tall pines swaying gently in the icy breeze. But as he gazed into the distance, he felt an inexplicable sense of unease, as if the trees were hiding something, watching. That night, the family gathered around the fire, sipping hot cocoa and laughing as they played charades. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Around midnight, as the children settled into their sleeping bags, Mark heard it, a low, guttural howl, unlike any animal he'd ever encountered. "Did you hear that?" he asked Lisa, who had been reading by the fire. She nodded, her brow furrowing. "Probably just a coyote. It's nothing." But Mark wasn't convinced. He stepped outside, the cold biting through his jacket. The forest was silent now, the only sound the crunch of snow under his boots. Yet, as he turned to go back inside, he saw it, a massive footprint, far larger than any human's, pressed deep into the snow just beyond the porch. The next morning, Mark showed the footprint to Lisa. It was nearly twice the size of his own boot, with a shape unmistakably humanoid. Jake and Emma, eager for adventure, begged to follow the trail it left behind. Despite his misgivings, Mark agreed, grabbing his rifle for safety. The footprints led deeper into the forest, weaving between the trees in a pattern that made no sense. Occasionally, the tracks disappeared entirely, only to reappear yards away. As they climbed a ridge, Emma pointed to a distant clearing. "Dad, look," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. In the clearing, a massive figure stood motionless. It was covered in thick, dark fur, his posture hunched but imposing. Even from a distance, his sheer size was intimidating. The creature turned its head, and Mark felt its gaze lock onto him. "Back to the cabin," he ordered, his voice low but urgent. "Now." The family hurried back, the sense of unease growing with every step. That night, as the wind howled outside, the Wallaces stayed close to the fire. Mark kept the rifle within reach, his eyes darting to the window every few minutes. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. Around 2 a.m., a loud crash jolted them awake. Something had struck the side of the cabin with tremendous force. Mark grabbed the rifle, motioning for Lisa to keep the children quiet. The crashing continued, followed by guttural growls that shook the walls. "It's trying to get in," Lisa whispered, her face pale with fear. Mark nodded, his grip tightening on the rifle. He crept toward the window, peering into the darkness. First, he saw nothing. Then, a massive shape moved between the trees, its eyes reflecting the firelight. The creature let out a deafening roar, its breath visible in the cold air. Mark fired a warning shot, the sound echoing through the forest. The growls stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, Mark thought it had worked, but then, the roof groaned under the weight of something heavy. The children screamed as the creature's shadow passed over the skylight, its clawed hands raking against the glass. "Into the truck," Mark shouted, grabbing the keys. Lisa ushered the children out the door as Mark fired another shot, forcing the creature to retreat momentarily. They sprinted through the snow, the truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. Mark started the engine, and the family piled inside just as the creature emerged from the shadows, charged toward them, its massive frame illuminated in the headlights. Mark floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning briefly before gaining traction. The truck barreled down the narrow forest road, the creature in pursuit. It moved with terrifying speed, its long strides closing the gap quickly. "Faster, Mark!" Lisa cried, clutching the children. Mark pushed the engine to its limit, the truck swerving as it sped over the icy road. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the creature stopped. It let out one last bone-chilling roar before retreating into the forest. When the Wallaces reached the nearest ranger station, they were pale and shaken but unharmed. Mark recounted the night's events, but the rangers were skeptical, attributing the damage to a bear. Still, when they returned to the cabin, the footprints and the claw marks on the roof told a different story. The Wallaces never returned to Sierra Nevada, but the encounter stayed with them. Mark's rifle, scratched and dented from the ordeal, became a grim reminder of that Christmas Eve. And though skeptics dismissed their story as a fabrication, the legend of Bigfoot in Sierra Nevada only grew. To this day, campers in the area report strange sounds in the forest during winter, and on Christmas Eve, when the snow falls and the world grows quiet. Some swear they've seen massive footprints leading deep into the woods, footprints that stop abruptly, as if their maker vanished into thin air. Story number 5. The Man in the Santa Suit, Los Angeles, 2008. It began as a Christmas Eve like any other on Knollwood Drive, a quiet neighborhood nestled in the sprawling chaos of Los Angeles. Families gathered, lights twinkled, and the warm hum of holiday cheer echoed in the streets. At the Ortega family home, the party was in full swing, a lively, boisterous celebration with relatives, friends, and neighbors crammed into every corner of the house. Laughter mingled with the smell of tamales and spiced cider as the clock ticked toward midnight. No one noticed the figure approaching the house. At first glance, he seemed to fit right in, dressed in a crimson Santa suit, complete with a fake white beard and black boots. He could have been any dad pulling a holiday prank. But this Santa's bag wasn't filled with toys. It was heavy, sagging at odd angles, and as he dragged it up the driveway, the soft jingling of Christmas bells gave way to a metallic clatter. Inside were weapons, a handgun, a flamethrower, and something darker than any list of naughty or nice could explain. He rang the doorbell. When the door opened, The warmth of the party spilled out onto the cold December night. It was Sylvia Ortega who greeted him, her cheerful smile fading to confusion as she looked into the hollow eyes behind the beard. "Who?" she started, but she never finished. The man in the Santa suit raised the handgun and pulled the trigger. The massacre was swift and brutal. 12 people dead. Fire consumed the house, flames licking up the walls and devouring the holiday cheer until nothing was left but ash and silence. The man, later identified as Bruce Pardo, a bitter, estranged ex-husband of one of the victims, was found dead hours later. A single bullet to his own head. For most, the story ended there, filed away as another senseless tragedy. But for the residents of Knollwood Drive, it was only the beginning. By the following Christmas, whispers had begun to circulate. Children playing in the snow claimed to see a man in a Santa suit standing at the edge of the park. Watching, parents dismissed it as overactive imaginations or remnants of the trauma lingering in the neighborhood. But then came the sightings at night. Clara Sandoval was the first adult to see him. It was late, just a few days before Christmas, and she was walking her dog past the charred remains of the Ortega house. The lot had been left vacant, a scar on the otherwise pristine street. As she passed, her dog froze, growling low in its throat. Clara followed its gaze and saw him, a man in a Santa suit standing in the shadows of the ruined lot. His face was obscured, but she could see the glint of something in his hand, a flicker of orange light. Fire. She hurried home, locking the doors behind her. That night, she dreamed of flames. By the second year, the stories had spread beyond Knollwood Drive. Teenagers dared each other to visit the Ortega lot at midnight. Most returned laughing, mocking the ghost stories as childish nonsense. But not all of them. Angela Martinez was 16 when her friends dragged her to the lot. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she felt the weight of the place as soon as she stepped onto the cracked pavement. The air was heavier here, the silence oppressive. Her friends dared her to stay 5 minutes alone. She agreed, mostly to shut them up. The first minute passed in uneasy quiet. Then she heard it, the soft jingle of bells. Her heart pounded as she turned toward the sound. There, standing at the edge of the lot, was a figure in a Santa suit. His face was still hidden by the shadows, but she could see the outline of something in his hand. A flamethrower. The jingle of bells grew louder as he stepped closer, and Angela did the only thing she could think of. She ran. Her friends laughed at her breathless panic, but when she tried to describe what she'd seen, the words caught in her throat. That night, she swore she smelled smoke in her room, though no fire could be found. Over the years, the sightings became more frequent. Always the same, a man in a Santa suit, carrying flames in his hands. The police dismissed the reports as pranks or coincidences, but the residents of Knollwood Drive knew better. The air around Christmas seemed colder now, the festive lights dimmer. The weight of that night in 2008 lingered like a bad dream that wouldn't fade. Some said it was Bruce Pardo's ghost, trapped by the violence he'd unleashed. Others believed it was something worse, a manifestation of the hatred and despair that had driven him to commit such horrors. Whatever it was, it didn't just haunt the Ortega lot. It haunted the memories of everyone who lived there. By 2018, the stories had spread far beyond Los Angeles. Podcasts, paranormal investigators, and amateur ghost hunters all descended on Knollwood Drive, eager to catch a glimpse of the infamous Santa. Most left disappointed, but a few left terrified. Take the case of Matt Harris, a YouTuber known for his debunking videos. He arrived with cameras, confident he could prove the ghost stories were nothing more than urban legends. But what his viewers saw that night was something else entirely. The live stream began like any other. Matt joked about the Santa ghost as he explored the Ortega lot. The video was grainy, the audio crackling with interference. But then, around the 37-minute mark, something changed. The camera caught it first, a faint glow at the edge of the frame. Matt turned, his flashlight sweeping over the ruins. And there he was, the man in the Santa suit, The jingle of bells was audible now, faint but growing louder, and then came the flames. A burst of orange light filled the screen, and Matt's scream was the last thing his viewers heard before the feed cut out. Matt was found hours later, unconscious but alive, his clothes singed and his hair reeking of smoke. He refused to speak about what had happened, and his YouTube channel went dark soon after. The Ortega lot remains empty to this day, a grim reminder of that fateful Christmas Eve in 2008. But every December, as the nights grow long and the holiday lights return, so do the stories. A man in a Santa suit, the jingle of bells, the flicker of flames, and the feeling that some ghosts don't stay buried. Story number 6. The haunted toy store of San Francisco. Nestled on a quiet corner of Union Street, the toy store didn't look like much. Faded awning, a cracked wooden sign that read Marley's Toys and Treasures, and a bell above the door that jangled weakly whenever someone entered. Inside, it smelled of old wood and faintly of lavender, a relic of the sachets the late Mrs. Marley had once tucked into the shelves. The place was cluttered, almost claustrophobic, with towers of dusty board games, shelves packed with porcelain dolls, and bins overflowing with plastic dinosaurs. It was the kind of store where time seemed to slow down, where even the air felt heavier, and it was haunted. The first incident happened on Christmas Eve, 1983. Mr. Arthur Marley, the store's owner, was locking up for the night when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of giggling. It was faint but distinct, echoing from the back of the store where the older toys were kept. He froze, the keys trembling in his hand. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The giggling stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, and then came the sound of tiny feet scurrying across the wooden floor. Arthur turned on his heel and ran, leaving the door unlocked behind him. When he returned the next morning, the store was as he'd left it, except for the small train set on the counter, its engine slowly circling the track, even though the batteries were dead. For the next decade, the hauntings became a part of the store's lore. Employees reported toys moving on their own, dolls turning their heads to watch passers-by, and music boxes playing faint, ghostly tunes long after they'd been wound. The activity always spiked in December, as if the spirit or spirits were celebrating Christmas in their own eerie way. Local children loved the stories. They dared each other to touch the haunted doll, a porcelain figure with blonde curls and glassy blue eyes that supposedly blinked when no one was looking. But for every child who laughed it off, there was another who swore they felt unseen fingers tugging at their clothes or heard a voice whispering their name. By 2002, the store had gained a reputation. Paranormal investigators began to take notice. One team, led by a brash young man named Evan Walsh, decided to spend the night in the store to document the phenomenon. They brought cameras, motion detectors, and an EMF meter. Arthur Marley, now in his 70s, handed them the keys and wished them luck. "You'll see her," he said cryptically as he shuffled out the door. The team laughed it off. "Who?" Evan asked, but Arthur didn't answer. That night, the investigators set up their equipment and waited. Hours passed with little activity. They began to doubt the stories. But then, just after midnight, the toys began to move. It started with the Jack-in-the-Box. The crank turned on its own. The tinny melody of Pop Goes the Weasel echoing through the dark store. The investigators froze, their cameras trained on the box. When the clown popped out, its painted face seemed to leer at them, and the air grew impossibly cold. Then the train set started up, its engine chugging along the track in slow, deliberate circles. One of the investigators reached out to stop it, only to jerk his hand back with a gasp. His palm was red and blistered, as if he'd touched something scalding. The EMF meter spiked, and the giggling began. It wasn't just one child, it was several, their laughter overlapping in a cacophony that seemed to come from every corner of the store. The team tried to stay calm, recording everything, but when a doll's voice box crackled to life, uttering the words, "Come play with us." They bolted. Evan Walsh later described the experience in a podcast. "I don't scare easy," he said, "but that place isn't right. There's something there, something old, and it's not just one ghost, it's them." When pressed on who them referred to, Evan refused to elaborate. By 2015, the store was struggling to stay afloat. Online retailers and big box stores had siphoned away most of its business. Arthur Marley passed away that year, leaving the store to his niece, Clara, who had grown up hearing the stories but never believed them. Clara planned to sell the property, but something stopped her. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was the strange feeling she got whenever she stepped inside, as if the air itself was alive. She decided to give it one last Christmas season before closing for good. The hauntings escalated almost immediately. Customers reported toys falling off shelves, music boxes playing dissonant melodies, and the giggling, always the giggling. Clara dismissed it as overactive imaginations and coincidences until Christmas Eve, when she stayed late to tally the registers. She was alone in the store, or so she thought. The air was heavy, and the faint scent of lavender lingered, just as she remembered from her childhood. As she counted the last of the bills, the bell above the door jingled softly. "We're closed," she called without looking up. The bell jingled again. Clara's heart raced. She stood and turned toward the door, but no one was there. The store was silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. And then the jack-in-the-box began to crank. The melody was slower this time, almost distorted. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the clown popped out, his painted grin wider than she remembered. The giggling started, louder than ever, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She turned and saw her, a little girl in a tattered dress, her hair in uneven pigtails. She was holding a porcelain doll, its face cracked and missing an eye. The girl smiled, but her eyes were empty, dark voids that seemed to pull at Clara's very soul. "Play with me," the girl said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Clara backed away, tripping over a bin of stuffed animals. The girl stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. "Stay," the girl said. "We like it when you stay." Clara scrambled to her feet and ran. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cold night air stinging her lungs. Behind her, the lights of the store flickered, and the faint sound of giggling followed her all the way home. Clara never returned to Marley's toys and treasures. The store was boarded up and left to decay, its once cheerful facade now a grim reminder of its haunted past. But every Christmas, passers-by swear they see lights flickering inside and hear the faint, ghostly laughter of children playing. Some say the spirits are waiting for someone to join them. Others believe they're simply reliving their favorite season, forever trapped in a store that no longer welcomes the living. So if you find yourself on Union Street this Christmas, listen closely. That laughter you hear might not be as innocent as it seems. Story number 7. The Haunted House in Pasadena. The house on Magnolia Street in Pasadena was a relic of another era. Its Victorian architecture, all steep gables and ornate woodwork, loomed over the quiet cul-de-sac like a forgotten shadow. For years, it had been empty, the kind of house children dared each other to approach but never entered. Every December, as Christmas lights adorned the other homes on the street, the old house remained dark, save for the strange, flickering lights that neighbors swore came from inside. It had been that way since Christmas Eve, 1930. That year, the Morgan family hosted their annual Christmas party in the house. Albert and Marion Morgan were the kind of people everyone in Pasadena knew. Wealthy, charming, and generous, with 3 children who were as golden as their parents. That night, their home was filled with laughter, the tinkling of glasses, and the sweet strains of holiday music. Outside, snow fell in rare, delicate flakes, muffling the world beyond the house. No one knows exactly what happened that night. Neighbors reported hearing a strange commotion just before midnight. A crash of breaking glass, a man shouting, then silence. By morning, the house was empty. The Morgans, along with their guests, had vanished without a trace. The only clue left behind was the dining room table, still set for Christmas dinner, with the candles burned down to stubs and the food untouched. Over the decades, the house passed from owner to owner, though no one stayed for long. It wasn't just the oppressive feeling that seemed to seep from the walls. Strange things happened there, especially around Christmas. Lights flickered on and off, despite the power being disconnected. Neighbors reported hearing children laughing. Though the house was empty, one man, a local historian, swore he saw figures moving behind the windows, dressed in the formal clothing of the 1930s. By the 1980s, the house was abandoned for good. City officials boarded up the windows, but that did little to stop the stories. Teenagers claimed they saw ghostly figures peering out from behind the curtains. A local journalist who dared to spend the night there emerged the next morning, pale and trembling, refusing to speak about what he'd experienced. It was December 24th, 2007, when Jenna Marshall decided to investigate the house. Jenna wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. A grad student in sociology, she was more interested in how urban legends spread and why people were so eager to believe in them. Armed with a notebook, camera, and a flashlight, she planned to spend the night documenting her experience. The house greeted her with an icy stillness. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like tinsel from the corners of the ceiling. As she explored, she noted the eerie silence. Even the sound of her own footsteps seemed swallowed by the house. Still, she found nothing unusual. No strange lights, no ghostly laughter, just an old, decaying house. Until midnight, the first sign was the lights. Jenna was sitting in the dining room, reviewing her notes, when the chandelier above her flickered to life. It wasn't the dim, unreliable glow of old wiring. It was bright, warm, almost inviting. Startled, Jenna looked around, expecting to see someone, a prankster, perhaps, but she was alone. Then came the laughter, high-pitched, giggling, unmistakably the sound of children. It echoed through the house, growing louder, closer. Jenna's rational mind tried to dismiss it as her imagination. But when she turned toward the sound, she saw them. 3 children stood in the doorway, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. The girl, with ringlets and a velvet dress, clutched a porcelain doll. The 2 boys, one older and one younger, wore suspenders and knickerbockers. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and unblinking. They didn't move, but their laughter filled the room, chilling Jenna to her core. Who are you?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl tilted her head, her smile unervingly wide. "We live here," she said, her voice echoing strangely, as if coming from a great distance. Jenna backed away, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her flashlight. The beam of light swept over the doorway, but the children were gone. The laughter, however, remained, now joined by a faint melody. It was the same Christmas carol she'd read about in the old police reports. Silent night. Panicked but determined, Jenna moved through the house, following the sound. It led her to the attic, a cramped, dusty space filled with old furniture and trunks. In the center of the room stood a single Christmas tree, its branches adorned with antique ornaments and flickering candles. Around the tree were the children, joined now by adults in formal attire. They were frozen, like mannequins, their faces turned toward the tree. The only movement came from the candles, their flames dancing unnaturally. Jenna raised her camera, snapping picture after picture, but as the flash illuminated the room, the figures turned toward her, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and anger. The laughter turned to whispers, growing louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't be here. a voice hissed behind her. Jenna spun around, but there was no one there. When she turned back, the figures were gone. The tree, the ornaments, even the candles had vanished, leaving the attic cold and empty, but the whispers remained, following her as she stumbled down the stairs and out of the house. Jenna never returned to the house on Magnolia Street, but she didn't leave empty-handed. The photographs she developed showed nothing unusual, no ghostly figures, no glowing tree, just empty, decaying rooms. But in the background of one image, taken in the attic, was a reflection in the window. A family gathered around a Christmas tree, their faces pale and hauntingly familiar. The house still stands, its boarded windows hiding whatever secrets linger within. Every Christmas, the neighbors report the same phenomena: lights flickering, laughter echoing, the faint strains of silent night drifting on the cold December air. And the question remains, what happened to the Morgans on that fateful Christmas Eve in 1930? Perhaps the house itself holds the answer, or perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Story number 8. The Ghost on the Golden Gate. The Golden Gate Bridge was always more than just a feat of engineering or a San Francisco postcard staple. It was alive. Its red-orange towers stretched into the fog like arms beckoning something unseen, something ancient. Tourists loved it, locals feared it, but beneath its steel and cables lay a darker story, whispered in coffee shops and on late-night taxi rides, especially at Christmas. That's when the woman in the red cloak appears. The first documented sighting happened on Christmas Eve, 1963. Joseph Hardy, a night watchman patrolling the southern end of the bridge, swore he saw her standing at the edge. She wore a flowing crimson cloak, the kind that looked out of place in the modern world, like something out of a Victorian drama. Her hair was long and dark, her posture stiff. Hardy shouted at her, fearing she might jump, but she didn't move. He took a step closer, his flashlight slicing through the fog, and in that instant, she turned to look at him. Her face was pale, almost translucent. Her eyes glowed faintly, as if reflecting light that wasn't there. Before Hardy could utter another word, she disappeared. Not jumped, not walked away. She simply vanished into the icy December air. Hardy quit his job the next day. Over the years, the sightings multiplied. Truck drivers crossing the bridge late at night reported seeing her standing near the railings. Joggers claimed to hear footsteps behind them, only to turn and find no one there. Most chilling of all were the stories from those who'd felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to climb over the railing, their minds filled with whispers urging them to let go. The whispers, they said, were always accompanied by a faint scent of salt and roses. By 2008, the legend of the ghost on the Golden Gate had become a staple of San Francisco lore. That was the year Emily Strauss, an investigative journalist for the Bay Chronicle, decided to dig deeper. Emily wasn't the type to believe in ghosts. She'd built her career exposing frauds and debunking myths. But there was something about this story that intrigued her. Maybe it was the sheer number of witnesses. Maybe it was the strange consistency in their descriptions. Or maybe it was the fact that no one could explain why so many of the sightings occurred around Christmas. Armed with a notebook, a recorder, and a skeptical mind, Emily set out to uncover the truth. The night was cold and damp, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Emily parked her car near Fort Point and made her way onto the bridge. It was nearly midnight, and the traffic had thinned to a trickle. The city lights shimmered faintly in the distance, their glow muted by the ever-present fog. She walked slowly, her boots clicking against the steel walkway. The wind howled, tugging at her coat and carrying with it the faint scent of salt. She'd interviewed a dozen witnesses in preparation for this night. Every one of them had mentioned the smell. Emily stopped at the midpoint of the bridge. This was where the sightings were most common. She leaned against the railing, her breath visible in the frigid air, and waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. The wind grew stronger, the fog thicker, Emily began to doubt herself. Maybe this was all just a story, a collective hallucination born out of fear and the bridge's tragic history. She was about to head back when she saw it. The figure, faint at first, emerging from the fog. The woman in the red cloak stood about 30 feet away, her silhouette stark against the steel cables of the bridge. Her cloak billowed in the wind, but her body remained unnaturally still. Emily's pulse quickened as she reached for her recorder. "Hello," Emily called, her voice trembling despite herself. "Who are you?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly to face Emily. Her face was exactly as the witnesses had described, pale, almost glowing, with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her. Emily took a step closer, then another. The air around her grew colder with each step, her breath coming in sharp, icy gasps. The scent of salt and roses was overpowering now, clinging to her like a second skin. She raised her recorder, her fingers trembling as she pressed the button. "Why are you here?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, the woman remained silent. Then, in a voice that was both soft and unearthly, she spoke. "I wait." Emily's stomach dropped. "For what?" she managed to ask. The woman tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "For them to see." "See what?" Emily pressed, her journalistic instincts overriding her fear. The woman raised one pale hand and pointed toward the water below. What was lost? What cannot be undone? Before Emily could ask another question, the woman stepped backward, her feet seeming to hover above the walkway. Then, with a sudden gust of wind, she vanished, leaving only the scent of roses and a faint echo of her voice. Emily didn't sleep that night. She spent hours replaying the recording, hoping to find some rational explanation, but the tape was blank. No voice, no wind, nothing but silence. Her article about the ghost was published the following week. It became one of the most read pieces in the Bay Chronicle's history, sparking renewed interest in the legend. Paranormal investigators flocked to the bridge, but none of them captured anything definitive. The woman in the red cloak remained as elusive as ever. But Emily wasn't done. She continued her research, delving into archives and old newspapers. It was in a 1937 edition of the San Francisco Examiner that she found her answer. The article detailed the death of a woman named Clara Rivers, a seamstress who had leaped from the bridge just days after its grand opening. Clara had been wearing a red cloak at the time, a gift from her fiancé, who had died in a car accident the week before their wedding. Her note, found in the pocket of the cloak, read, "He waits for me in the water." Now, every Christmas, Emily returns to the bridge. She stands at the midpoint, her recorder in hand, and waits. She hasn't seen the woman again, but she's certain she will, because some ghosts don't haunt places. They haunt moments. Story number 9. The Ghost of Santa Monica Pier. The Santa Monica Pier has always been a magnet for the living. Tourists swarm the boardwalk, laughing and snapping photos, drawn by the carnival lights, the salty air, and the faint melody of the carousel. But for those who know its history, the pier isn't just for the living, especially at Christmas. That's when the laughing begins. It was the winter of 1924 when they pulled him from the water. Samuel Carter, a dockhand who worked at the pier, had vanished after his shift one December night. They found his body tangled in seaweed near the pylons, his face frozen in an expression of terror. The police ruled it an accident. The waves had been rough that night, and Carter had been drinking. At least that's what they told his widow. But rumors spread. Some said Carter had been pushed, the result of a drunken brawl gone too far. Others whispered that he'd seen something in the water, something that had pulled him under. Whatever the truth, his death marked the beginning of the stories. By the following Christmas, the first reports came in. Visitors claimed to hear laughter, a deep, unsettling sound coming from beneath the pier. Others swore they saw strange lights flickering near the old Ferris wheel, which had been shut down after Carter's death. The lights danced and pulsed, casting eerie shadows on the wooden planks. And then there was the smell, a faint, briny odor that clung to the air long after the tide had gone out. By the 1970s, the ghost of Santa Monica Pier had become local legend. Tourists came for the chance to hear the laughter or catch a glimpse of the lights. Most left disappointed, chalking it up to overactive imaginations or the power of suggestion. But a few left terrified. Take the case of Helen Reyes, a street performer who worked the pier every December. Helen had heard the stories but dismissed them as nonsense. That changed one cold Christmas Eve when she stayed late to pack up her gear. The pier was nearly empty, the crowds long gone, and the lights of the carousel had dimmed to a faint glow. Helen was humming to herself when she heard it, a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to echo from the wooden beams beneath her feet. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The laughter grew louder, more insistent. Helen grabbed her flashlight and peered over the railing, shining the beam into the dark waters below. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then, just as she was about to turn away, something moved. A face emerged from the shadows, pale and bloated, with empty eyes that seemed to lock onto hers. Helen screamed and stumbled back, dropping her flashlight. When she looked again, the face was gone, replaced by the rhythmic lapping of the waves. By 2005, the pier had undergone numerous renovations. The Ferris wheel was replaced with a newer, safer model, and the old wooden planks were swapped out for sturdier materials. But none of that stopped the stories. If anything, the renovations seemed to stir up the past. Mark Jensen, a security guard hired to patrol the pier during the holiday season, was a no-nonsense type who prided himself on his rationality. Ghosts weren't real. He'd tell anyone who brought it up. But even Mark had to admit there was something off about the pier at night. One evening, just a few days before Christmas, Mark was making his rounds when his radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end was faint, distorted by static. "Help me." Mark froze. The voice wasn't one of his co-workers. It sounded older, rougher, and unmistakably desperate. He tried to respond, but the radio went dead. Moments later, the lights on the Ferris wheel flickered, casting strange, spinning shadows across the boardwalk. That's when he heard it. The laughter started softly, like a whisper carried on the wind, but quickly grew louder, filling the air with a cruel, mocking tone. Mark's flashlight beam danced across the pier as he searched for the source, his heart pounding in his chest. Then he saw it. Near the base of the Ferris wheel stood a figure. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but Mark could see the outline of a man, his clothes dripping with water. The figure raised a hand and pointed directly at Mark before vanishing into thin air. Mark didn't wait to see if it would come back. He ran, his boots pounding against the wooden planks, the laughter chasing him all the way to his car. Today, the ghost of Santa Monica Pier is as much a part of the pier's identity as its cotton candy and carnival games. Paranormal investigators flock to the site every Christmas, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. Some claim to have recorded EVP's electronic voice phenomena with messages like, "Get out," or "I'm still here." Others report strange lights and sudden temperature drops. But the most chilling accounts come from those who venture beneath the pier. The space beneath the boardwalk is a tangle of wooden beams and dark corners, the perfect setting for a ghost story. Many who've dared to explore it report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they're being watched. Some even claim to have seen a figure lurking in the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. On Christmas Eve, the pier is at its eeriest. The crowd's thin, the carnival lights take on a ghostly hue, and the waves crash against the pylons with a relentless rhythm. Those brave enough to stay late might hear the laughter or catch a glimpse of the lights near the Ferris wheel. And if they're very unlucky, they might see him, the ghost of Samuel Carter, still searching for whatever dragged him into the cold, dark water all those years ago, So if you find yourself at the Santa Monica Pier this Christmas, take a moment to listen. That laughter you hear might not be coming from the crowd, and the lights that flicker might not be the carnival at all. From ghostly Santa sightings to haunted piers and echoes of lost souls, these tales remind us that even the brightest holiday lights can cast the darkest shadows. Which of these stories left you with chills? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more eerie tales and supernatural adventures. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, the ghosts of Christmas past might still be closer than you think.